this lesson, we're going to start evaluating the strategic alternatives that have been developed. Let's not waste any more time and let's get right to it. Many companies have established objectives against which to screen strategic alternatives. At a minimum, the chosen strategic alternative must meet 4 criteria. It must be mutually exclusive and would not preclude pursuit of another alternative. It must be a complete strategy that considers all the key strategic issues. It must be an internally consistent strategy for the entire company and not contradict mission, objectives, and policies. And finally, it must be doable and have a reasonable probability of success. But these aren't the only criteria that folks have suggested. Another model, presented by researchers Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington, evaluate the strategic options against 3 success criteria, namely suitability, feasibility, and acceptability. Suitability, in other words, will it work, which speaks to the overall rationale of the strategy. And as the CFO, the analysis tools you would use to support suitability would include decision trees and ranking strategic options. Feasibility speaks to whether or not it can be made to work. So does the company have the resources to implement the strategy, including the funding, the people, the time, and the information? Here, the CFO will use tools such as cash flow analysis, financial forecasting, and break-even analysis. And finally, we have acceptability. In other words, will it meet the expectations of key stakeholders? And here the CFO will be integral in helping to articulate how each strategic alternative creates value, whether shareholders will suffer any dilution, the risk-return profile of the opportunity relative to the risk tolerance and the risk capacity of the company. When making strategic decisions, a healthy amount of debate and conflict can ensure that the strategic alternatives are adequately considered. A consensus trap is something that occurs when there's not enough debate and everyone simply agrees on one alternative. Let's discuss a few techniques that you can use to ensure that this doesn't happen in your strategic planning exercise. The devil's advocate technique specifically assigns an individual or group of individuals to identify potential pitfalls and problems with the proposed strategy. A dialectical inquiry technique is one which requires that at least 2 proposals from separate groups be prepared for each strategic alternative. And finally, you may set up a strategy shadow committee which uses a separate group of lower-level employees from within the organization who have access to all the same strategy materials as senior management and the board. And the group of employees are asked to separately and critically evaluate the proposed strategy and provide feedback on what the company should be doing instead. Now, research supports these sorts of approaches, as is the debate, not the format, that improves the overall decision-making. These approaches force development of better assumptions and recommendations and achieve a higher level of critical thinking amongst the strategic planning team. A number of world-class organizations, like Shell Oil, use scenario planning to help develop and evaluate strategy. It's not a small undertaking, but if you have a large, complex business, this sort of analysis can provide decision makers and strategists with a much deeper insight into the business. So let's just quickly walk through an approach to developing corporate scenarios. First of all, in the first step, you brainstorm possible scenarios. You'll consider what the industry will look like 15 years down the road and the strategies the company could pursue to position itself in each of those scenarios. And for each industry scenario, you'll develop a set of assumptions, develop a range for each of the major assumptions, so optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely. Keep in mind that assumptions are required for all those areas where there's a significant uncertainty. For example, GDP growth, market regulation, significant industry trends, etc. In the next step, you'll prepare common-sized financial statements using historical results to serve as the basis for the trend analysis. You'll build a financial model that can integrate the impact of your range of assumptions on the major financial balances and reforecast the results. You'll adjust each income statement and balance sheet as necessary to reflect the implementation of the strategy for each alternative. Finally, you'll construct a detailed set of pro forma financial statements for each strategic alternative and each a set of assumptions, your optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely. You can prepare ratio analysis and compare it to historical results to identify superior strategies. The result of scenario planning analysis is a forecast and range of possible outcomes. Risk can be inferred by the spread between the pessimistic and the optimistic cases. Note that probabilistic analysis, such as Monte Carlo analysis, can further refine the profile into an S-curve. This sort of analysis can also help identify which assumptions have the greatest impact on the business and produce what is called a tornado chart. Now, it's beyond the scope of this course to tell you exactly how these pieces of analysis are constructed, but look for a future course on decision analysis. Finally, to close this lesson on evaluating strategic alternatives, I thought it'd be helpful to spend a moment looking at strategies that have proven themselves over time to be less than successful. Let's start with the follow the leader strategy, which is when a company copies its moves from their biggest competitors. This is a poor strategy for a couple of reasons. First, it assumes that the leader strategy is actually best. So, for instance, Fujitsu tried to follow IBM into the mainframe business. Meanwhile, the mainframe business was rapidly becoming obsolete. Secondly, it ignores the company's specific strengths and weaknesses. Another poor strategic approach is to always be trying to hit another home run. Companies that discover highly successful products are tempted to try to do it again and again. For example, Microsoft repeatedly has tried different lines of businesses, many of which have lost them billions of dollars. Nothing has come close to the strategy of continually improving and re-releasing its Windows operating system. An arms race strategy is to engage competition in an all-out war to gain market share by cutting prices and spending money on marketing and development. The problem with this strategy is that most of the time you end up not only hurting your own company, but poisoning the entire industry. Look no further than the airline industry for the poster child of what the results are when you engage in an all-out arms race. Next, we have the do-everything strategy. And the problem with this strategy is that the company that pursues too many opportunities inevitably loses focus. New endeavors consume large amounts of management time and organizational resources. I'm involved with a company that at one time had 5 different and distinct lines of businesses, 3 of which sucked all the energy and resources of the company and made little or no money. We sold off the 3 dogs and held on to the 2 good businesses, and I can tell you it's remarkable at how much simpler life has become. Not to mention that the company is now making more money than it had when it had the 5 lines of business. Don't fool yourself. Bigger is not always better. Which leads us into our last bad strategy, and that is one of the losing hand. Management and boards are often too stubborn to admit failure and will continue funding bad businesses not only with money, but with their time and energy. Companies need to recognize early when companies have peaked or when the risks going forward outweigh the benefits, so that proactive measures can be taken to preserve as much value as possible. This may require the company to make a tough decision, like selling off a profitable business line or closing it even though it's marginally profitable. But it's not only necessary, it's the right thing to do. So not only have I given you a few strategies that have proven themselves, here's a few strategies that have done just the opposite. That's all for this lesson. So until next time, don't stop to get to the top. To get to the top, don't stop.